I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. As America, indeed the world, is still coming to terms with the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. The photograph of the former president, surrounded by Secret Service, bloodied but unbowed, fist raised in defiance, may yet prove to be the image of this election, despite it being 113 days away. Yet this is a country that knows political violence all too well. 4 of its presidents were assassinated. Abraham Lincoln, 1865, James Garfield, 1881, William McKinley, 1901, John F. Kennedy, 1963. Others, like Trump, have survived the attempt, most recently Ronald Reagan in 1981, and other political figures like Martin Luther King have also paid the ultimate price. Little wonder that both Donald Trump and Joe Biden have called for calm, called for unity. Here's the 46th President of the United States speaking in the aftermath of the attack on the 45th.
There's no place in America for this kind of violence, for any violence ever. Period. No exceptions. We can't allow this violence to be normalized. You know, the political record in this country has gotten very heated. It's time to cool it down.
But can this country heal what are clearly some very deep divisions? Later, we'll look in depth at the history of political violence in the United States with one US historian. But politics there continues, of course. Republicans are gathering in Milwaukee for the party's national convention. President Trump is due there later, but there already our US correspondent James Matthews. James, good to see you. Look, we have just been hearing Joe Biden speaking from the Oval Office, from the Resolute desk, looking fairly presidential, you have to say, on an occasion such as this. But I suppose it's the rhetoric that's important, and calling for some of the temperature to be taken out of political debate in the United States. Well, you could have probably predicted he'd say something along those lines. Yeah, calling for a lowering in the temperature, a reduction in the political rhetoric, which is clearly framed the events of the past 72 hours. The Oval Office address, it's a time when a president will address the nation, eyeball the American audience, when there is a degree of gravity, often, usually, in times of conflict, war and so on. And I suppose conflict is a key word in all of this, political conflict. He spoke in very stark terms, used phrase like killing fields, a political battlefield, said that that's what Americans had to avoid. His call for unity across the political divide is a noble ambition, and the ideological differences just divide society as a whole. But I suppose if there are people in the United States looking for a silver lining to the cloud, you might well see it in that Donald Trump too is styling himself as a healer, talking about this potentially as a moment for not just the country but for the world to unite. And I suppose we should expect more of that sort of rhetoric later on when Donald Trump, we are expecting, will address the Republican National Convention. He has said that he has rewritten his speech. He gave an interview on his way from New Jersey to Milwaukee to the Washington Examiner and New York Post. We're told that he had a gauze bandage on that section of his ear that took the bullet. But he was clearly a former president in reflective mode. Donald Trump was talking about how, he wasn't supposed to be here, expressing a disbelief that it was the turn of the head on stage that saved him. That bullet, he was saying, would have hit the back of his brain. But projecting ahead to this big gathering of Republicans in Milwaukee, who knows, perhaps the leadership of both president and contender for the White House will give Americans a lead and allow the country at large to proceed along a path more peaceful. However, that has to be a long shot, given the general political context and the environment that has been created through years of bitter political struggle and hard political rhetoric, which is being extolled, by many in the wake of the shooting. Listen to the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Republican representative who will speak at the convention. Her reaction is that the Democratic Party is flat out evil and accusing it of
trying to murder President Trump. Balanced, of course, by others who are calling for a more positive reaction to this. Speaker Mike Johnson, among others, he's echoed the words of the president and the call for unity by Trump.
But as you've said, I mean, Joe Biden himself talking about putting Donald Trump in a bullseye previously, he can expect those remarks to be thrown back at him time and again. Even in his statement from the White House, he drew links between what happened on the 6th of January, the Capitol Hill riots, the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, the intimidation of election officials that took place during the last presidential campaign. Donald Trump, for his part, you remember him saying, I could stand on Fifth Avenue, shoot someone and not lose votes over it. I mean, it's great to hear both these guys talking about unity and turning down the temperature of this debate. But if it happens, I'm going to gently suggest it will probably only be temporarily.
I think that's where the good money would be, Neil. Yeah, I mean, clearly, right now, America is a country in a degree of distress at what they have witnessed in the past few days. And as such, you know, there is sympathy for Donald Trump, and the emotions around politics have rather turned on their axis. But, you know, politics will resume at some stage. We are 4 months short of an election, which has been a bitter struggle. And, you know, we have an election campaign that is based around attack, one side attacking the other in the most aggressive terms.
Thanks, James. More from you later. But up next, we look back at the history of political violence in the US and ask what hope that this is the moment the country comes together rather than falls apart. Back soon. Welcome back. 4 presidents assassinated and a number who, like Donald Trump, have taken a bullet and survived. The United States knows political violence like no other. Dr. James Cooper is Associate Professor of History and American Studies at York St John University. Good to see you, Dr. Cooper. Look, given that the United States has been here before, time and again, what went through your mind when you heard about the attempt on Donald Trump's life?
Well, of course, it was late at night, and a friend of mine messaged me, and I went straight on the news, and it's very much a case of, like, here we go again. You know, how serious could this be, not just for Donald Trump, but also for the people in the crowd as well? And what would happen to the shooter? Who did this? What could it be about? The politicization of all of this. So I suppose multiple things go through your heads based on, you know, an understanding of history and the sense of, you know, we have been here before.
Can we say then, with hand on heart, that political violence is commonplace in the United States? I mean, your mind does immediately go to, you know, they're not 1, not 2, but 4 sitting presidents assassinated in US history: Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and of course JFK latterly. I mean, that number could well have been 5 this morning when we were talking. But is it true to say that there is a problem with violence in US politics?
America's always been divided, not necessarily in terms of in violence, in terms of extremes and very passionate debate, partisan debates, but that's how it was set up. America's meant to not have kind of like a tyranny of one individual, with checks and balances. If you go back to right at the start of the early republic, the idea of fake news is not new. Thomas Jefferson, for example, his enemies told the American people, one newspaper, that he was dead during an election campaign. So this isn't necessarily anything new. Also got to think about the context of all these different shootings, where Lincoln, of course, was no secret service. He went to the theatre, having, you know, won re-election. You know, the Civil War was coming to an end. You know, disgruntled Southerner, Confederate John Wilkes Booth came and shot him. Garfield and McKinley, of course, both shot by individuals. Garfield by a disgruntled Republican, and also, of course, McKinley was shot by an anarchist, which is part of maybe the more of a global, worldwide phenomenon. Anarchists trying to cause trouble to push their concerns forward. And of course, John F. Kennedy, of course, the official view of being, again, an individual. But I think perhaps in terms of the broader story of political violence, it's about these divisions and why these things happen and why people are doing things. And then, of course, that part of the story as well is the response to it. So even though there is this kind of history of violence, when the partisanship goes up to that higher level, often there is also this sense of coming together as well as this reconciliation.
If we see acts of political violence in the United States as an act of dissent, as an act of dissatisfaction with the way in which politics is going, how then to view this attempt on the life of Donald Trump, who, of course, formerly US president, in the running to be the next president, but currently not sitting in the White House with any of the power that a president possesses.
But of course, Trump was not the first non-sitting president to be the victim of political violence. So obviously Martin Luther King Jr. Was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was killed in 1968, having won the primary. George Wallace, of course, who was the infamous segregationist governor of Alabama, shot 5 times when he was running for the Democrat nomination in 1972. So it's not just necessarily presidents who get targeted. You're quite right. Donald Trump, of course, is no longer the president. He's a candidate, and he was shot at as well. Of course, in terms of Trump, we don't know why the individual did it. Obviously, the individual was killed by the Secret Service, and we will never know really what was going through that individual's mind. But quite often, it seems to be passed off either a disgruntled individual or somebody perhaps who wants to make themselves famous or have got very kind of bizarre ideas. When Ronald Reagan, when John Hinckley Jr. tried to assassinate him, it was all about impressing Jodie Foster, who had just seen in the movie Taxi Driver. So yes, you have these individuals make these very bizarre, violent acts, but it's not necessarily a widespread things where people are, rocking up to rallies or campaign events. There is obviously this pattern of individuals doing things and acting on things within these contexts of times of great political division.
Well, look, both Biden and Trump have now talked explicitly about the country needing to come together. But I'm just wondering, James, is that actually possible?
Well, I suppose anything is possible. I suppose politics in recent years, you can't rule anything out. But
true that.
Again, it's kind of like the violence is not new. This pivot then to unity is not new as well. So, for example, when you have Reagan, the assassination attempt on him in 1981, he was a lot worse off than people would have you believe at the time. He was very close to death. And Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, was a Democrat. He was the last Democrat standing after the 1980 election. They had this kind of maybe a personal friendship, but very fierce political rivals. And O'Neill was one of the first people in to see Reagan. The story says he kissed him on the head and he prayed with him. God bless you, Mr. President. So often you can actually bring political rivals together. They can't think about the bigger picture, that perhaps there's more that they agree on that they actually disagree on. Bobby Kennedy, of course, so he was the one, as well as in 1968, he had to break, he's assassinated himself, but early before then, he had to break the news to a predominantly African-American crowd about the murder of Martin Luther King. So he had to say that, famously said, my brother was also murdered by a white man. And he starts talking about the need for unity and understanding and compassion in the United States. So it's certainly maybe sometimes a bit of a wake-up call.
Yeah, but I suppose, though, politicians at times like this would say things like that, even if they were not of that mind. And I do wonder whether or not what both Joe Biden's people and indeed Donald Trump's people will be thinking of right now is whether or not incidents of political violence of this type do serve to shift the dial, to move the polls in anyone's favour.
Well, certainly in terms of Trump, obviously that famous image of him now standing up with his fist out, and that's going to be the image of the year. And in many respects, that may well have sealed his re-election because he's kind of triumphantly stood up after an assassination attempt. In contrast, of course, to Joe Biden, who had his debate debacle. So perhaps, it confirms that Trump is this kind of like guy that won't go away, that he's the strong man of America compared to Joe Biden, of course, who is clearly not, perhaps not well or having certainly not the guy he was many years ago. But of course, I'm sure the Biden team will actually be quite relieved that actually the story now is about Donald Trump, and maybe gives them a bit more time to think about what they're going to do in terms of next steps for their own election campaign.
Working in this business, I'm very much a glass half empty type of fella. But even from your position as someone who has studied this country and studied this country's politics inside and out, it strikes me that you seem to be firmly in the glass half full camp, that this potentially could be a moment for some of those significant divides that exist in the United States to be healed.
I suppose today I'm a glass half full person. Often days I'm glass half empty. I can be very cynical about politicians when I'm writing and researching, but there is definitely a lot to be divided about. Obviously, you can never be more divided than the Civil War itself, but in terms of the run up to the Civil War, the real question about America is about the future of the country. Will it be all slave or no slave? Will certain states be slave states or free states? And as the Union was expanding, of course, now the overturning of Roe versus Wade, it's about, which some states will have access to a women's health care in terms of abortion, other states won't. So in terms of the future of the country, what is it all about? Of course, we forget that America is a young country. They're still in many ways trying to live up to those lofty goals of all men are created equal. So they're still trying to find their feet. The question is, are either of these politicians the person to do that? So Barack Obama, for example, he was able to unify the United States in 2008. A fresh face, didn't have really much of a record to say that he couldn't be a unifier. And of course, he's this unifying figure after the War on Terror, the Iraq War, George W. Bush years, and so on. And the question is, can Biden or Trump be a face of a unified America? Can they be the people to actually heal the country, bring people together again? Or will it come to maybe someone else, perhaps the Democratic Party, to be a new person to step forward to take on that challenge?
Just on that specific point of civil war, a remarkable bit of polling that I saw come out just at the tail end of May, so some distance away from where we are now, but the Marist National poll suggesting that 47% of Americans thought another civil war in their lifetime was likely or very likely. Now, there is clearly a degree of unease among significant parts of the American public, not just about the American dream and their day-to-day lives, but about the future of the Republic.
Absolutely. Whatever happens in November, I suppose two things will happen. One is that Donald Trump will rock up in January to be sworn in. If he wins or loses, he'll say he's won. And the second thing is that all the losing side, after the attempt on his life, on the footage you can see when he's carried into the big black Secret Service car, you can actually see some supporters facing the camera, giving the finger, swearing, angry. Basically, he says, look, he's still alive. You couldn't get him. So the anger about Trump is not going to go away. So is Trump going to be the guy, despite what he's now claiming to, bring people together?
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Well, let's return to James Matthews at the RNC in Milwaukee. James, of course, you were in Milwaukee for the Republican National Convention. Might be a little bit too early to have taken the temperature amongst delegates there. It's very much the opening hours of the very first day. But what are we expecting from this convention?
We're expecting a celebration of the Republican Party and where they stand right now. So we will have something like 2,500 delegates in the one arena. Donald Trump will be anointed as the party nominee. We will find out who he is going to pick as his vice presidential pick. A few contenders for that. I've mentioned J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Doug Burgum. So we have that element of Donald Trump, a triumphant Donald Trump. We haven't seen him between the incident in Pennsylvania and this convention. He's been kept very much away from public view. Yeah,
we can talk about a party united, James, but you know as well as I, better than I, that there are plenty of never-Trump Republicans, and I suppose the RNC in Milwaukee might give us our first idea of what the events of the past 72 hours and indeed the speech that Donald Trump will make will have on those Republicans who swore that they could not support this guy.
We're in a situation where Donald Trump will enjoy a sympathy. He will take, I think, admiration from people who hadn't turned their head to Donald Trump in the past. Admiration for the way he handled that event and how he's handled himself in the days since. Do you look at those iconic photographs of him with his fist in the air, defiant in the middle of Secret Service agents? A man standing defiantly in the face of armed aggression. Americans look at that, and Americans, see themselves in that. And I think those who have not been Trump-aligned, will look at that, and there will be a sense of admiration. There will also be a sense, I think, politically, looking ahead, for those who have been looking for Trump alternatives. They'll look at that and think, well, this is an individual who has taken the Republican Party ahead in the polls. He looks like he will win the November election right now. There will be those who say there are no. If there were alternatives before Saturday, then I don't see an alternative to Donald Trump in terms of who will win the election and carry the hopes of a Republican Party and its right-wing politics into the White House.
Thanks, James. That both Joe Biden and Donald Trump are talking about unity, about healing, about there being no place for violence in US politics is a good thing. And they follow, well, in some pretty big footsteps. It was, of course, Abraham Lincoln who said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And he was right, though it didn't exactly end well for him, did it? That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again soon.